They said she froze to death in a ditch on the reservation. No name, no cause, no one looking. But the truth? She was executed. And for a long time, no one said a word. Don't forget to follow us on social media. Just search for The Michael Braa Show on Insta, Facebook, YouTube, or the KC CBS 47 Plus app. In the winter of 1976 on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, a woman's body was found in a shallow ravine. There was no ID on her. Her face was unrecognizable from exposure and time. Local authorities said she had likely frozen to death and moved quickly to bury her, unclaimed, unnamed, and forgotten. But she wasn't a nobody. Her name was Anna Mae Aquash. She was Mi'kmaq, and she was from Nova Scotia. She was a warrior, a mother, and one of the most respected women in the American Indian movement. And she didn't die by accident. She was taken to the Badlands, made to kneel, and shot in the back of the head. Her death would go unpunished for nearly 30 years. Her story was silenced, distorted, and buried, first by the government, and then by the very movement she had given her life to. And like too many Native women before her, and since, her murder was treated not as a crime, but as a complication. We now call it the MMIP crisis, missing and murdered Indigenous persons. But back then, there wasn't a name. There was just the loss and the silence. Anna Mae's story is one of the earliest and clearest examples of everything that's wrong with how Indigenous women are treated in North America. She wasn't a bystander, she was the central. And the fear she carried of being erased, of being misrepresented, of being killed and blamed, turned out to be completely justified. In this episode, we're going to walk through the facts of her case, the forces that surrounded her, and the truth that came too late. This is her story, and one we need to tell. Before she was a name on an autopsy report, before she was a body left in a ditch, Anna Mae was a force of nature. She was born in Nova Scotia in 1945. Mi'kmaq through and through, raised in a world that gave her every reason to keep her head down. Poverty, discrimination, systemic erasure, but she didn't, not even close. She moved to Boston in her 20s, and that's where something clicked. She found the Native resistance movement. And once she did, there was no turning back. She joined AIM, the American Indian Movement, in the early 1970s, right as it was gaining national attention. And these were the days of Wounded Knee, the trail of broken treaties, and a rising tide of Indigenous defiance. Anna Mae didn't just show up to protest. She helped run the damn thing. She cooked, she organized, she taught, she carried rifles when needed. But what made her so dangerous, what made her different, was her voice. She was smart, disciplined, and unafraid to speak hard truths, even inside the movement. And AIM was, make no mistake, a man's world. It wasn't built for someone like her, a woman who didn't ask for permission and didn't keep quiet when something felt wrong. People listened to her. And in movements like that, especially ones under siege, influence like hers can look like a threat. To the government, yes, but also to the men trying to hold their movement together by any means necessary. By 1975, the FBI had classified her as a potential extremist. They kept a file on her. She'd already been arrested more than once, one time at protest in Custer, and another on a raid on Rosebud. They knew who she was, they watched her, and they tried to turn her. There's a story, and it comes from more than one source, that after one of those arrests, a federal agent told her flat out, if you don't cooperate, you won't live out the year. Now, I don't know how she felt in that moment, but I know what she did after. She went right back to work. She kept organizing, she kept moving. That fall, she was traveling across the country with Dennis Banks, Leonard Peltier, and other high-profile AIM leaders. We won't kid ourselves. They were on the run, trying to stay a step ahead of law enforcement, hiding out, believe it or not, in Marlon Brando's motorhome of all things. trying to avoid surveillance, but the pressure was mounting. The FBI had informants embedded all over AIM by then, people feeding them information, whispering in the right ears, and sowing distrust. And somewhere along the way, a rumor started that Anna Mae might be one of them, an informant, a snitch. There was no proof, no evidence, just the fear. And when fear takes hold in a movement that's already under siege, it doesn't take much to turn friends into suspects. That fear would follow her all the way to the end. In Denver in late 1975, she was staying with an AIM friend when 3 members she knew came to get her. They said AIM leadership wanted to talk to her and take her back to South Dakota. She went with them, maybe because she thought she could clear her name, maybe because she didn't want to cause a scene, but maybe because she already knew deep down there wasn't any safe choice left. This is where the story turns. This is where the silence begins to fall over everything. Because from that point forward, almost no one said anything, at least not for years. And what they did say was wrapped in contradictions and missing details, in decades of silence and fear. But one thing is certain, Anna Mae didn't run. She didn't hide. She stood her ground, in front of the federal government, in front of her own people, and in front of the people who would eventually decide she had to go. She was not quiet, absolutely. By the end of 1975, the American Indian movement wasn't what it had been. What started as a grassroots fight for dignity and treaty rights had become something else, fractured, hunted, and in many ways afraid of its own shadow. The FBI's campaign against AIM was brutal. Counterintelligence operations, psychological games, and it was all real, and it worked. The agency had already been caught using lies and forged letters to get Black Panther leaders to turn on one another. They used the same playbook on AIM. They embedded informants and then let paranoia do the rest. At least 60 Native people were murdered on the Pine Ridge Reservation between 1973 and 1976, a time known as the Reign of Terror. Some were shot by vigilantes, others just disappeared, and almost none of those cases were ever investigated, let alone solved. This was the environment Anna Mae was walking into. So when the call came, when AIM's so-called security cadre decided she needed to be brought back to South Dakota to clear her name, the outcome was already written. They weren't bringing her home, they were taking her away. She was picked up in Denver, where she'd been staying with a friend named Troy Lynn Yellowwood. 2 men, Arlo Looking Cloud and John Graham, along with an older AIM member named Theda Nelson Clark, drove her out of the city. She didn't resist, and according to the people who were there, she told her friend she didn't want to cause trouble. She probably thought she could explain things, that she could calm things down. But by then, it wasn't about what was said or what she did. It was about what others believed. They drove all night, first to Rapid City, where she was held in AIM offices, interrogated, and moved from house to house. The questions were always the same. Are you informing? Did you talk to the feds? What do you know about Peltier? Someone, we still don't know who exactly, produced a letter they claimed was proof that she'd agreed to cooperate with the government. But the letter was never verified. Her own attorney said it was a lie, a piece of theater designed to justify what they had already planned to do. Behind the scenes, the phones were ringing. AIM leadership in Minneapolis, Vernon and Clyde Bellecourt, were in touch with the people in Rapid City. Some said the order came from them. Others pointed fingers at Dennis Banks or Leonard Peltier or David Hill, although none of those men were ever charged. Most denied everything until the day they died. But the fact remained, Anna Mae was in custody. She was tied up, passed house to house like a prisoner, and when morning came, they drove her into the Badlands. That stretch of land is empty and wide, the kind of place where sound just disappears into safe, and no one is coming to help. They pulled off the highway, walked her up to the ridge of a ravine, and then one of them, likely John Graham, put a .32 caliber pistol against her head and pulled the trigger. She was 31 years old, a mother of 2, and she died alone. Later, forensic examiners would determine that she didn't die instantly, that she had curdled into a fetal position after the shot, and that she likely froze to death from blood loss and exposure. which means for at least a few moments she knew. She knew what they'd done, and she knew no one was coming. And the men who brought her there, they got into a car and they drove away. Not a one of them called her family. No one reported her missing. And no one in AIM said a word, because they already knew. It would be more than 2 months before anyone found her body. February 24th, 1976. A local rancher was riding along the edge of his property in the northeastern corner of the Pine Ridge Reservation, a remote wind-stripped stretch of land near Highway 73. That's where he saw her. At the bottom of a small ravine, curled and still, half covered in snow and soil. He called the authorities. The Bureau of Indian Affairs and the FBI showed up. The body had no ID, no purse, no jewelry. Her hands were stiff, frozen in a position that told its own story. Rope burns at the wrists, blood on her cheek. But they didn't recognize her. They wrote her down as a Jane Doe, Native American female, about 30 years old. A government pathologist named Dr. W.O. Brown did the autopsies right there at the Pine Ridge Memorial Hospital. He missed the gunshot wound completely. Wrote her off as another Native woman who died from the elements, exposure, case closed. No one reached out to the AIM community. No one contacted her family. No one listened to the local women, like Gladys Bissonette, who had already suspected weeks earlier that Anna Mae was missing. Some of them even offered to come by and identify the body in person. The FBI refused to let them see her. Instead, they cut off her hands, literally, shipped them to Washington, D.C. for fingerprint analysis. And then they buried her. March 2nd, 1976, Anna Mae Aquash, still officially unnamed, was lowered into a pauper's grave on Pine Ridge, a quiet hole in the ground, no marker, no ceremony. That was the second time they tried to bury her. The first is when they left her body in that ravine. This was just more official. It wasn't until the next day, March 3rd, that the FBI finally got a match. Fingerprints came back, and it was her. But it was a few more days before they'd tell anyone. When word finally reached her family in Nova Scotia, her daughters were told by phone. No explanation, no apology. Just a name confirmed and a funeral already passed. Her family and the attorneys working with AIM demanded a second autopsy. The first one had been too quick, too careless, and they were right to question it. On March 10th, her body was exhumed. Dr. Gary Peterson, an independent pathologist, performed the examination on the remains. And almost immediately, the truth came to light. There it was, a single .32 caliber bullet lodged at the base of her skull, fired at point-blank range, a contact wound, meaning the gun had been pressed against her head when it went off. It was clear, undeniable. This was no accident. This was a murder. She had bruising on her wrists, rope marks. There were signs she may have been beaten. And given the condition of the body, some questions about whether she may have been sexually assaulted. Those couldn't be answered. What could be answered is she'd been killed, left outside, and allowed to vanish from the world without a name on her grave. The second autopsy, her remains were reburied, this time with her name and with the presence of her family and friends who came to mourn her properly. But not a single AIM leader showed up. Not Dennis Banks, not Vernon or Clyde Bellecourt, not Leonard Peltier, no one. They weren't there at the funeral, but many of them were already whispering behind closed doors that maybe she'd been working with the government. Maybe she'd brought it on herself. They buried her again, once in a shallow grave and now in a rumor. And for years, that's where the story stayed.
Trust. It's hard to get and easy to lose. When the risk of loss is great and people are hurting, who do you trust? How about the people trusted by the biggest names in business, agriculture, and government? Atlanta's Private Investigations, building trust one case at a time.
I'm Michael, founder of Atlanta's Private Investigations. Let's talk. When you need help, your answers are here.
Hey, and welcome back to CARES Corner. I know we talked about the MMIP crisis back in May, but working on Anna Mae Aquash's case this week reminding me that this isn't just a one-time conversation. This crisis is still happening, and we need to keep talking about it, because this is bigger than just one case, and we're not here to just talk about violence. We're here to honor the lives behind the headlines and shine a light where others don't. Right now in the U.S., there's about 4,200 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous people. Men, women, children, families are still waiting for justice. More than 1,600 Indigenous people are currently listed as missing. That means over 1,600 families are still searching for answers. Indigenous women represent under 2% of the U.S. population, and according to the 2020 census, they identify as American Indian or Alaskan Native alone or in combination, totaling around 1.1 to 2.9%, depending on reporting. Yet, in some places, their presence in missing persons cases is alarmingly high. For example, a 2021 report from the Montana Department of Justice found that Indigenous people made up of 30% of all missing person cases, while constituting only 6.7% of the state's population. For most women in America, the leading causes of death are things like heart disease and cancer. But for Native women under 35, homicide is one of the top killers. And it's just as bad in Canada. Indigenous women are about 6 times more likely to be murdered than non-Indigenous women. First Nations and Inuit people make up just 5% of the population, but in some years account for up to 16% of female homicide victims. This isn't a coincidence. It's a pattern, and it's a crisis. Anna Mae Aquash. She was a fighter, a mother, a leader. She stood up for her people and paid the ultimate price. It took 30 years to get justice in her case, but it happened because people refused to stop saying her name. And today, that same fire is still burning. People are demanding answers and turning grief into action. And that's what we're here to do. We're not just here to listen, we're here to witness, to amplify, to make sure these names don't fade into silence. So if you're part of this community, and you are just by being here, then you have a role to play. Don't underestimate that. You don't have to solve a case to make a difference. Sometimes it just starts with paying attention, with sharing a post, showing up, or saying the name of someone the world forgot. So stay loud, stay compassionate, and stay curious. That's how we make sure these stories don't end only in tragedy, but also in truth. I'm Kara, and that's all I got. I'll see you guys next time.
For decades, nobody was held accountable. The people who had taken Anna Mae from Denver, the ones who interrogated her, or drove her out into the Badlands, or watched her kneel down in the snow, they went back to their lives. Some stayed in the movement, and some faded into the background. Some drank themselves to death. Others ran for office. And all the while, Anna Mae's name sat buried under a narrative no one wanted to touch. Not the government, because they had every reason to let her death disappear. Not AIM, because to admit what happened would be to admit how deep the paranoia had gone. And not the public, because when Native women go missing, the world tends to look the other way. But her daughters never let it go. Denise and Debbie, 2 little girls who lost their mother without explanation, who were told lie after lie, who grew up with a ghost instead of justice. They pushed. They gave interviews and they organized, and they kept asking the same question: why? Why did it take 30 years to get an indictment? Why did it take 2 autopsies, media pressure, and the passage of time before anyone spoke the truth? Why was Anna Mae treated as expendable, first by the state, and then by the people she trusted most? It wasn't until 2004 that Arlo Lookingcloud was finally convicted. He had confessed years earlier, not to the FBI, but to people in the community, to friends, and to Anna Mae's daughter. He said he was there. He said he handed the gun to John Graham and nodded, and then it was done. Graham himself was extradited from Canada and convicted in 2010. Life without parole. Nobody else was charged. The woman who allegedly organized the abduction, Theda Nelson Clark, was declared unfit for trial, and she died without ever speaking publicly. The others, the ones that made the decisions behind the scenes, who gave the orders or stood by as it happened, they were never brought to court. Many are now dead. And yet, what happened to Anna Mae didn't end with convictions. It became something larger. Because if you look at her story, if you really look, you start to see the blueprint for what we now call the MMIP crisis, the missing and murdered Indigenous people. You see law enforcement that didn't care. You see families shut out. You see a body discarded, unnamed, and misdiagnosed. You see decades of silence. You see the system doing exactly what it was designed to do when it comes to Native American women. Nothing. But you also see something else. You see a mother who stood her ground. A woman who refused to be quiet. You see her children refusing to let the world forget. You see strength. Anna Mae Aquash was never an informant. That rumor, the thing that got her killed, was a lie. And even if she had been, even if she had decided that she didn't want to die for somebody else's politics, that still wouldn't have justified what they did to her. She was murdered because fear won, because cowardice dressed itself up as loyalty, and because people with power decided that protecting the myth was more important than protecting a woman. But she didn't vanish. Not really, and not anymore. Her name is spoken now. At rallies, at ceremonies, in courtrooms, she's remembered not just as a victim, but as a mother, warrior, leader. Her story has become a warning, a symbol, and a call to action. There are still many more like her, still missing, still waiting to be found, still waiting to be named. This story was about one woman, but it belongs to all of them. Say her name. My name is Michael Braa, and I'm a citizen of the Muskogee Nation Indian tribe. I want to talk to you about a crisis deeply personal to me and so many Native American communities. It's the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous people, often shortened to MMIP. This isn't just a headline or a statistic, it's a painful reality affecting our families, our friends, and the very soul of our communities. Every year, thousands of Indigenous women go missing or are murdered across the United States, Canada. Indigenous women face murder rates of more than 10 times higher than the national average. In some communities, murder is among the top 10 causes of death for Native women. The Bureau of Indian Affairs estimates that there are approximately 4,200 unsolved MMIP cases in the U.S., though advocates believe this number is likely much higher due to underreporting and limited data. Between 2011 and 2020 in Wyoming alone, 15% of missing persons were Indigenous, totaling over 700 unique individuals. Imagine a mother waiting anxiously for her daughter to return from the store, a daughter who never comes home. And this heartbreaking scenario repeats itself thousands of times across our country. Right now, over 9,000 Indigenous people are missing in the United States. Each one has a name, a story, and loved ones desperate for answers. Yet for too long, those prayers and cries have gone unheard outside of Indian country. When a non-native child goes missing, national news coverage and swift law enforcement action follow. But when an Indigenous person disappears or is murdered, there's often a deafening silence. Media coverage is scarce, and public alerts and search parties rarely materialize. It's as though our loved ones matter less. I'm here to tell you clearly, they're not less important. Their lives matter just as much as anyone else's. I've seen the pain in a father's eyes recounting the day his little girl didn't come home. These are American citizens, failed by the very system designed to protect them. Why is this happening? It's rooted in a history of marginalization and broken promises to Native peoples, complicated further by tangled legal jurisdictions. Investigations stall when tribal, state, or federal authorities can't quickly determine the jurisdiction, causing costly delays, and many tribal police departments are severely underfunded, covering vast regions with too few officers. This perfect storm, under-resourced law enforcement combined with jurisdictional confusion, allows cases to slip through the cracks, emboldening perpetrators who believe no one is watching. But there is hope, and momentum is building for change. Native voices are rising, saying no more. In 2020, Congress passed Savannah's Act and the Not Invisible Act, improving data collection and interagency coordination. Task forces are reopening cold cases, and Washington leaders are finally listening to Native advocates. May 5th is now National Awareness Day for missing and murdered Indigenous women, symbolized by red dresses and red handprints to honor those lost. And for the first time in decades, our communities see real progress. New laws, dedicated offices, better data aimed at addressing this crisis. And you, right now, listening, have an important role. Educate yourself and others about MMIP. Share the stories of Indigenous victims. Say their names so they're not forgotten. Support laws giving law enforcement essential tools and our communities the justice they deserve. If you work in media or government or law enforcement, use your platform to spotlight the crisis. Treat our missing and murdered with the urgency and dignity you'd show your own family. Because to us, they are family. We must no longer let this remain an invisible issue. These are our sisters, our brothers, and our children. And when we raise our voices together, we send a powerful message. We will not let our people disappear silently. We will seek them, and we will seek justice. I'll leave you with this thought. True justice will come when the Indigenous people no longer disappear or face violence at alarming rates. When our sons and daughters grow up without fear. That day is within reach if we remain committed to change. Let's remember those we've lost, fight for those we can bring home, and protect our future generations. Madhu, thank you. Thank you for listening.